why don't we kick it off? So super excited for our first session in the Aroha room. And so our first speaker is an experienced economist who makes economics easy. He is also an author, a media commentator, and a thought-leading public speaker. So welcome, Shamubeel. Over to you.
Thanks, Erica. Look, it's great to be here. So just give me a bit of a thumbs up if you can hear me fine and all that kind of stuff. Awesome. So I'm always a little bit surprised when people invite me over to speak at their things, because an economist is probably not the most interesting person you can talk to. But I've been thinking a lot about what's been happening with COVID, but also what it means in terms of not just our economy, but our society and the way we think about things. And one of the things that has become very clear to me over the course of the last few weeks is what we do during this period is very much about laying the foundations for what happens next. It has shaken us to our core. A lot of our assumptions have been questioned and have been shown to be false. And when future generations look back at what we do in this moment and what happens from here, I think we will be judged by our actions and by our morality and by our philosophy that dictates our actions and our values. So this may not be a very normal thing for an economist to talk about, but throughout this Unconference, I'd like you to think about one word that I think really typifies what we need to see the most of. And that word is love. I don't like the word thing. I'd like words like empathy, because I think it's not human. It's not human enough. We should be thinking about words that encompass no conditionality. It should be about what are we actually going to do, not for just ourselves, but our community, future generations, and all those kinds of things. And the reason I say that we have to think about the word as love as our, North Star is because what we're going through is a once in a 100-year event. What we experience today and in coming weeks and months is going to scar large parts of our population. The economic consequences are going to be very significant. How we deal with it is going to decide whether or not the people who are affected by it come out of it in a more resilient and strong way. And we have to be very creative. And we have to be creative because the ways that we've done things before are simply not going to work. Because the size of the challenge, the complexity of the challenge of what we're dealing with today cannot be papered over by the policies and tools that we've used over the course of the past 40 years. The way I think about it is the last 40 days have undone the orthodoxy of the last 40 years. It is absolutely true that the things that we thought were true in terms of capitalism, in terms of the size of government, the importance of safety nets, the importance of community, all those things are being reverted back to something that was, I guess, more familiar in history rather than the last 40 years. And I suspect a lot of us will experience this in stages over coming weeks. We'll have a certain kind of experience during this lockdown. And in a way, we're cocooned in our homes and shielded from the reality of what's happening outside. But I also know that when we come out of this lockdown, there is this purgatory period where our borders will still remain closed. There'll be economic carnage where there'll be businesses that fail. There'll be many of us who will lose our jobs and our livelihoods. And it's going to hurt for a lot of us. And how we look after each other, how we deal with it is going to be critical. And within all of this, we're going to find ourselves transitioning to a new normal. And that's where I want to focus a little bit today, because I think that's what you guys really want to talk about and what the rest of this Unconferences will be about. I might start with, I guess, a little bit of a personal reflection. And that is, there is no other place in the world I'd rather be today. And the reason for that is, by our actions, we have shown that what we value first is lives, people. And this to me is really critical because it's about the values that we place in the way that we think about things. It is also true that for an economic perspective, saving lives and going through this once properly, this lockdown properly, is going to be better than multiple waves of infections and lockdowns and all those kinds of things. But it's not the economic thing that drives my reflection of what's happening right now. It's the values that we are using. And that values to me is very resonant with my own personal values, which is that we need to think about each other first. Community comes first because the economy and those kinds of things are functions of a community. And I'm also really proud that our democracy is still functioning relatively well in this extraordinary period. Around the world, we're going to see democracies essentially crumbling as a result of what we're seeing. So this is going to be one of those big shockwaves that will change the face of the world, whether we're thinking about societies, economies, politics, and democracies. And yet I think New Zealand's going to come out of this better, stronger, and more resilient than many other places if we take the right decisions and if we work together. A lot of my job is forecasting, right? So I say things about what's going to happen in the future. And yet I think right now, one thing that's become very clear that forecasting is a fool's errand. There is no rule book for thinking about what will happen in the future. And that in a way is extraordinarily liberating because it means that we're not constrained by our history, constrained by our past thinking. We can really ask, what is it that we want to achieve? What are the key things that we want to make sure that we protect? What are the key things that we want to stimulate and grow and replace in this new normal that's coming? And having said that, it's still helpful to get a sense of the size of the problem. And about 2 months ago, in the beginning, at the sort of late February, I thought, oh, look at this thing that's taking place. I think it looks a little bit like what happens with the SARS outbreak in Asia quite a few years ago. A week later, I thought, oh, this is probably going to be as big as the global financial crisis. A week later, I thought, holy shit, I think we're looking at the Great Depression. It doesn't mean that's what's going to happen, but that's the scale of the issue that we're dealing with. And it means that the response that comes with it has to be commensurately big. It is bigger than anything that we've experienced before, both in terms of the size of the number of people affected, but also what we have to do to be able to help people, help save businesses, and help save jobs. And I think the world is going to look very, very different. The world's going to look different in part because over the course of this lockdown, we've seen that a lot of what we take for granted is changing. So our thinking in terms of where the economy was 3 months ago, 2 months ago, is very different from where things are today. We've gone from thinking about full employment to mass unemployment. We've gone from thinking about essentially business as usual, incremental change, to really going back to first principles thinking, asking, what can we do differently? Are we getting the outcomes that we want? Is our safety net fit for purpose? Is our health system truly resilient? These are big questions. They can't be solved quickly, but these are questions that we must keep asking. We went from a very physical world to a very digital world. We went from office for work, and now we think going to the office is going to be about community and catching up with people and connecting with people. So it reframes our interactions, reframes our thinking in quite a big way. I suspect many of us have liked and not liked parts of having to be with our family and home all the time, but I suspect most of us are dreading going back to that commute and the traffic jams. I think we're going to see big changes in the world. The whole globalization story had been under attack for a long time. We're going to see a lot of decoupling that's going to take place. We've thought about things like just in time in our supply chains, that we'll get things just in time. We'll build in no resilience when it comes to our manufacturing, when it comes to our retail. And all of a sudden, now that we were living in a COVID world, we're asking the question, is that the best way to do it? And again, this is an orthodoxy that lasted for 40 years. The just in time, the inventory management, the way we do business are things that were very much the reality of the last 40 years, and yet they're being shaken to the core in 40 days. We are living through a time of extraordinary change, and which way we go is up to us. And part of that is because I think this is probably the first time we're having a really good conversation about what is the role of government, what is the role of society, what is the role of communal assets and communal efforts. Everybody who talks about capitalism is now asking for a handout from the government to save their businesses and save their livelihoods. And it is as it should be, but we forget these conversations when times are good. A few years ago, it was the last election, I said tax is love, and you wouldn't believe the blowback I got, because tax is not love, it's theft, people told me. I'm sure those are the very few people who are first in queue to get subsidies to save their businesses today. So there's quite a lot of that stuff goes on where people can be very selfish when times are good. They think it's because of them. We forget the role and the value of community, how we are all a product of our environment as well as personal effort. And we shouldn't discount the importance of community, the importance of working with each other, because that's truly what makes us successful. That's what makes us unique, but also makes us part of the wider group and whānau that makes us successful, happy, and all those kinds of things. And there's been stuff that I've been really impressed by in terms of, I guess, not impressed, at least sort of a reveal, right? We thought about success as how much people were paid or how much people were made, how wealthy they were. And yet through this lockdown, the people who are carrying the economy, the essential workers, are quite often the least paid, work in terrible working conditions, and are essentially propping up our entire society with a mere few 100,000 people who are literally holding everything together. These are the heroes. These are the people that make our society function. And yet, quite often, these are the people that we take advantage of. And Stephen talked about extractive. I would also like to add the word exploitative. So much of what we do is exploitation of people. Yet, those are the things that we actually want and need. How is it that the things that we need, we value so lowly? And yet the things that are luxuries, we value so highly. There is something inherently corrupt in our thinking that I think we need to ask both of society, but firstly of ourselves. But there's some things that are not going to go away. If anything, what's happening right now is going to open up those old wounds that we have always known about, whether it's about inequality of incomes amongst ethnicities, amongst communities, whether it's about poverty, whether it's about climate change. These are the big issues of generations that are not going to go away, regardless of what happens with a recession or a public health crisis. All it does is it rips open those papers that we had papered over the course of the last 40 years. You wouldn't believe the number of conversations I've had about poverty and inequality and home ownership and the rights of future generations, and they go nowhere. And yet, this is the time we have to think about those things, because those very groups that are the most vulnerable in society are the ones who are going to get hit the hardest, will bear the brunt of the consequence of what's going on right now. But also, the cost of the cleanup is going to be placed on those who can least afford it, the future generations who have no say in it. So I think we have some very big questions to ask and some very big things to think about. The way that I'd say that this conversation will unfold in coming weeks is we're probably going to have this sense of euphoria when we come out of the lockdown, because we'll be happy to reconnect with others. But I suspect that happiness is going to be marred by the reality of what's happening in the economy, that we are going to find that there are many people, and I think thousands of people, who will lose their jobs. There'll be thousands of businesses that will fail in coming weeks. To give you some context, in the last recession, we lost less than 100,000 jobs. In this recession, I think we'll be measuring it in hundreds of thousands. Literally hundreds of thousands of Kiwis will be out of work in coming weeks. And that means that we're going to experience poverty in a way that we haven't before. When people talk about our welfare system, it's pretty easily available, but boy, they don't give you a lot of money to live on. The drop in income from going from paid work to unemployment might be in the order of 25 to 80% drops. So we're talking about big reductions in incomes, your ability to pay your bills, to the ability to live your lifestyle, even at a small proportion of where you were, is going to be very, very difficult. And unless we can make sure our safety net is truly strong, truly tight, we are going to find that there is a lot of pain amongst the people that we know, our friends and our families. And I hope that it makes us think much harder about our welfare safety nets, because what we did in terms of building this post the wars in New Zealand and in many places around the world has been undone and made mean and grudging over the course of the last few decades. And we have to really rethink, is this what we want to do? Do we want to push people down into poverty and keep them there because we're so evil? Because that really is what is happening right now. The reason why I think this is going to be an opportunity is because the shock is going to be so unprecedented. It literally is going to touch so many people that I think all of New Zealand is going to be touched by this particular event. It may not be the first one or the last one that does that, but it is an opportunity for us to rethink how we think about our economy, how we think about our constructs, whether it's economic constructs or political constructs, or even our own values in terms of what we think is important and what we think is valuable. A lot of the reasons why I think this is going to be very telling for New Zealanders is we're probably going to go through this better than other places, and yet we'll find that the pain is real, the pain is large, and the pain is widespread. And when you look around the world, what you're going to find is this is going to be something that really kind of resets the way we think about economics, politics, and social institutions. And we have to think about what does it mean for us as New Zealanders to reshape and rethink that stuff. Because there are no easy answers. The problems are the same old, but we have a license to start dealing with some of those issues. And I think that opportunity is only going to last 12 to 18 months. While we are all locked away from the rest of the world until a vaccine is invented, while we're still going through this period of incredible uncertainty, but also having to rely on each other, because all we'll have over the course of the next 12 months is us, each other. There's nobody else who's going to help us. So I think it's going to be a very, very opportune time for us to have these big conversations, but also a time for big changes when it comes to politics, policymaking, and all that stuff. There is a new normal that's coming on the other side, and I think that new normal is going to come as a result of both the recession, but also a lot of the good things that we are experiencing right now. Our ability to connect across technology, across the internet. I think a lot of this stuff is going to stick. We may not drive as much. We may not go to the office as much. We might spend more time with our friends and our families. Because if one thing that's done for me anyway, is I've realized how much I enjoy spending time with my family and friends. And I'm going to do a lot more of that as a consequence of it. And I'm going to do a lot less traveling on a plane because quite frankly, it's a waste of time and it's terrible for the environment. So, sorry, Air New Zealand, but I'm not going to be supporting you as much as I used to. And I suspect we'll all make some big changes as a result of this. And it is going to mean that we'll be preparing for significant amounts of technology adoption. We're going to do things differently. We're going to change the way we transport. We're going to change the way we think about how we do business, how we organize our lives. Are we going to go out and eat out as much as we used to? We may not. We've all experienced for the last month, I don't know about you, but my credit card bill, I just paid it off, was 50% of what it is normally. All of a sudden I'm going, what am I wasting my money on? All those necessary coffees, it turns out are not so necessary after all. So there's some big changes that are taking place that will stick. And these big events tend to have long lingering effects. And that's really, really important. And I think what we're seeing right now is that policymakers around the world are responding, right? So whether it's the central banks or the governments, we're doing big stuff, stuff that we never thought we'd do. Central banks are printing money, they're lending money to banks, they're doing everything they can do to make sure our country functions. The government's doing the same. Already we spent tens of billions of dollars to just blunt the pain of the recession. We haven't even started planning for what's going to happen in terms of unemployment and what's going to happen with the recovery. By the time this is all said and done, we might see the amount of debt that the government has, currently about $90 billion, is probably going to double. That's how much it's going to cost us. And that money has to be repaid somehow. And we're going to have to ask very carefully, what is the fair balance between what we pay for in the current generation and within our generation, who are the right people, the wealthy, the well-paid versus everybody? And how much burden do we place on future generations who have no say on the fact that this virus escaped because of climate change, because of rampant economic and environmental destruction, because of all those things that they had no say on. And yet we're going to ask them to pay for this stuff, even though they might inherit a world that's more polluted, more unequal, and all those bits and pieces. So I think there's going to be some really big questions for us to ask over the coming weeks and months when we realize that there's some big things that are taking place. The reason I'm telling you all this stuff is from a macro perspective. To me, that's the problem statement, not the solutions. What you guys are going to talk about today is very much about the solutions. So let me leave you with the thoughts that I started with. We will be judged by our actions. This is a once in a 100-year event. Don't waste a good crisis. Old ways of doing things won't work. That's how we got here. What we should be doing is thinking about resilience, thinking about collectivism, about each other, thinking long-term, thinking about 100-year out, thinking about future generations, giving them as much weight as we do to ourselves, because we should be less selfish. And what is our North Star? What's the one thing that should guide us? My proposition to you is there is only one North Star that we can all get behind, and that word, that is love. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So let's wave our hands to indicate that we're clapping. We don't have a lot of time, so in this session, what we thought we'd do is actually send you out to a breakout room with a group of 3 or 4 people to discuss this question, having listened to the talk about economy and foundations for the future. What do you think we should be building foundations on? So Stephen will send you out to breakout rooms, and I will post this question in the chat for you to discuss in the next few minutes.